So hey everyone, my name is Maria Lamardo. I'm a senior program manager at GitHub, and I'm excited to be here to talk to you all about accessible components. So with that, let me go to the next slide. Here are the slides. I'll leave it up on the screen if anybody wants to kind of go follow along as I go. But today I'm going to be talking about reusable components that work and how to really make them accessible. All right, so I see a couple of you are still taking the QR code. Okay, perfect. So here's the agenda for today. I'm going to be going over how you can use some specifications to help you build accessible components. And we're going to be focusing on reusable modals, accordions, and tabs that work for everybody, right? And then this will kind of help you create best practices to make other types of components that are accessible. So we can build accessible components with the help of Aria, which stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. Now, Aria is a set of attributes that you can add to HTML elements to improve the accessibility of your content. So in order to build accessible components, you have to ensure that the right information is being passed down to the browser, which in turn then passes it along to different types of assistive technologies. So Aria has roles and attributes that you can use to improve and expand on certain elements by adding additional semantics, which will kind of help you enhance your HTML with things that it cannot do semantically. So in that, you can use things like roles that tell assistive technology what type of element an item is, which can affect how users expect to interact with something. For example, if you have an element with a role of button, it's letting the user know how to interact with it and what they can expect from it. Then there are things like properties that add additional characteristics to that element. Like, for example, if you have an input field and you're adding Aria required equals true, it lets the user know that this is a required or mandatory field that they must fill out for the form. And a state indicates the current condition of an element. And we're going to see this in one of the examples that we have in the presentation for accordions, that you can add something like Aria expanded and set it to true or false, and that will let the user know whether an element is collapsed or expanded. So let's quickly jump over to an example that I have for toggle buttons. So in here, and let me just zoom in a little bit more. But in here, we have a toggle button. So I'm going to just go ahead and inspect the first one. And then you could see that I'm using Chrome, and I'm under the accessibility tab. So where you would find the styles, there's an option for accessibility. And this will give you a couple of options to kind of go through. I really like looking at the accessibility attributes of an element and then the computer properties. And it's going to tell you things like, what other attributes have you added? Also, what are things like the names or some of the states that you've added for this element. So I'm going to go ahead and start interacting with this one. So right now it's not pressed, and we can see that because it says press false. And as I start interacting with it, you could see that now it changed to true. And I'm just going to toggle that a couple of times so you can see it change live. And what that's going to do, it's going to tell not just your browser, but also assistive technologies that this is either pressed or not pressed, right? So you've interacted with it. Same for this type of element where we have a button that is going to allow us to either display or hide our password, right? So I'm just typing something here, but you could see that when it's true, we can see it, and then you can see that kind of changed here. One of the things that I also want to call out, so not only are we seeing things like role of button or the state of pressed equals true or false, but it also tells us things like the name of an element. And you can set that by the content of that element, or also you can hard kind of code it with an Aria labeled or Aria labeled by. So you can see that we're getting the name of that button, which is kind of an image, so it doesn't really have a name. And we're calling it show password. So let's go back to the slides and see like how that works. So you can set names and descriptions to your elements with Aria. So Aria label will allow you to set a string value that will label that specific element. And then this is great for when something is not visible or present on the screen, or it's not enough to give a proper name to something. This is when you're going to want to use Aria label. And then when something is present on the screen and it is enough to describe something, you can use Aria label by. which is going to grab you can point to different IDs of an element or many elements to give a current name to something. Unlike this, you can use Aria describe by to describe an element with something that's already on the screen. And we're going to see a couple of examples of how to use this in the components that we build. Before we go on, I just want to call out that the first rule of Aria is don't use Aria. Definitely use native elements whenever possible. Native elements do have built-in accessibility features that work across different assistive technologies already. So you want to kind of leverage that function that's already there. You also want to make sure that you're avoiding redundancy. So you're not using Aria or Aria attributes to duplicate functionality that already exists. So you don't want to do something like set role equal to button in a button element, because that's already semantically available for assistive technologies. And this might actually create more complexity or confusion for assistive technologies and assistive technology users. You also want to validate that the Aria attributes that you're using are appropriate and correctly used, since this can actually make your website less accessible. So if you're using Aria the wrong way, you can actually be making it less accessible. And actually, WebAIM, the WebAIM Million Report, which is a yearly report that WebAIM does, that evaluates the homepages of the top 1 million websites, finds that homepages that have Aria present actually average 34.2% more detected errors than those without Aria. So again, the misuse of Aria is worse than not using Aria at all. All right, so let's get into modals. Before I get into modals, I also want to talk about why Aria. Let me jump over to the Why Aria tab. So Why Aria stands for Web Accessibility Initiative Aria Authoring Practices, which is a guide to help you understand how to use Aria and create accessible applications. They also have this page for patterns that also describes and recommends best patterns and explains kind of concepts behind them for different types of components. So let's go ahead and open the modal dialog one. And in this pattern, we're going to see something that we're going to see in all of the different patterns that they have. The page structures are the same throughout, but you're going to see kind of a description of what this pattern or what this component should be used for. They're also going to provide some examples, so real life code, right, how they build it. They're also going to add in here the keyboard interactions that people expect. Now, this is really important because if you're a keyboard user, you're used to, like, if you're interacting with a modal, you have expectations of what keyboard commands you should use to make it behave the way you expect, right? So if we're not building it with that interaction in mind, then some users might be lost in our application. Then these pages might also give you a little bit of like design considerations. But most importantly, I think this is like kind of where we want to focus today, is it's also going to talk about what Aria role states and properties you should be thinking about. So I'm going to go ahead and jump back to the slides. So I'm gonna in my slides is the same kind of information that we found in documentations, just kind of a shorthand. But pretty much the design considerations for the modal, as called out in the specs, is that we should have a button that closes the dialog. We should also create visual styling that obscures the content behind the dialog, so that you're preventing users from interacting with the content behind the dialog. They also call out something for focus interaction. So when the dialog opens, focus should be set to either the first element or a static element on top of the dialog, like maybe the title of the modal, right? And then make sure that this is done because it might make the content easier to read, and you also want to make sure that all of the content is visible when you do this. If you're setting focus like on the last element in the modal and you're missing the first paragraph of the content in the modal, like try to avoid doing that. You also want to make sure that you're setting focus to the least destructive action. So if the first interactive element is something like, yes, I want to permanently delete my account, somebody's likely to press that by mistake, so try not to do that either. So just go with the most used element interaction, right? That allows the users to kind of move forward in the flow. When you're closing the dialog, they also call out some of the specs for this. You want to make sure that you're setting the focus to the element that either invoked opening the dialog Or if that's no longer available, setting focus is something that provides like a logical flow, right? Maybe the next step in the sequence of steps that the user needs to take, or if it's unlikely that somebody's going to reopen that modal, you might want to set it to something else other than the element that invoked the focus, the dialogue to begin with. And then they also list out some of the keyboard interactions that people expect, like looping back as you kind of tap through and tap back in the modal. All right, so we've talked about a lot. Let's talk about some of the Aria rules and properties that they kind of talked about. So they talk about having a container that has a role of dialogue. This also should have an Aria modal set to true that translates to assistive technologies that this is a modal. They also talk about having an Aria labeled by, describing what that is, and also the Aria described by to have a description if you want. So let's take a look at that kind of implementation here. So we see that role equal dialogue and all of the Aria attributes that they've asked me to provide. And you could see that I'm mapping that Aria labeled by to the title of my modal because I feel like it might be descriptive enough. So that's kind of what you would do here. So let's take a look at an example of a modal. So I'm going to just open this up. Let me just zoom in here a little bit more. But you can see that I have the properties opened up to this button. And when I open the button, it's going to make this kind of modal appear. Now, this is where we have set the role of dialogue. And again, if I'm checking my Aria attributes down here, you could see that that role is coming through properly and that I have the Aria labeled by with that ID. And if I go down here, you could even see it highlighted. Ooh, let's go back. You could either see it highlighted as I kind of move to where that value is coming from. So that's really helpful. And then Aria modal equal true. So we have all the properties available. And I'm just going to start tabbing through so you see that I don't have access to whatever's behind the modal. If I shift or shift back, I'm only having access here. And if I press the escape key, I'm actually going to be able to close that modal. So let's go back to the slides and talk a little bit about accordions. So I'm going to jump over to the accordion docs. So again, similar to what we saw with the modal, it's going to talk about the pattern, what this component might be used for. For this example, it also calls out different pieces that a component might be made out of. So for this section, it talks about accordion headers and accordion panels. Again, it has examples of something that's coded and the keyboard interaction expectations. And again, we're seeing the role states and properties. And again, this is the structure that they have for all of the components that we talked about on that first page. So jumping back to the slides, here are the design considerations. Right, so accordions are something that are interactive, where you can have like a title with a corresponding content. The header is what kind of controls what shows in the panels, which is whatever holds your content. And then they talk about keyboard interactions here. So again, this is exactly what the specifications are telling us to do. And they will also call out things that are optional, so things that you might not want to implement if you don't choose, and things that are absolutely required that keyboard users will expect for this component. So here, some of the callouts that they talked about from the technical perspective is that each accordion header has to be wrapped in a heading, and then inside that heading should be a button. It also should have Aria controls, which will kind of create a relationship between the header button and the panel content, and it will inform which piece of content the accordion controls, right? And then expanded, which informs the users whether or not the accordion is expanded or not. And then you could also disable this if you want to. Optionally, you could add role regions, which are okay if you don't have too many regions already on your page, and you could use Aria labeled by to help provide an additional name for this. So here's kind of the implementation for this. So on the left-hand side, you see the header buttons, and on the right-hand side, you'll see the content panel. So you could see that we have Aria expanded to true, what the ID for the Aria controls are to the corresponding content there. And let's get into an example. So in this example, I'm going to go ahead and jump to the button, which we can see is wrapped in an H2. And if I go to the accessibility panel, you see that the Aria expanded equals false. And as I toggle it, you can see that it changes from true to false. And that will be the case for all of them. And then as I move down to the content that it's controlling, you see that that's pairing it to that specific button with the Aria control. So it's telling me that this is the piece of content that that button is controlling. I'm going to go ahead and turn on my screen reader. Let's test it together. Let's see how loud this is. Ooh, give me 1 second. All right. And this little box is kind of what the screen reader is going to be reading. Let's see, sound is not coming through. Well, as you can see from the box, sound is not coming through, y'all. So you can see from the box that it says like item 1 expanded versus item 2 collapsed. And if I interact with it, it's, yep. Ooh. Yes, it's in there. Let me try again. Sorry. Sorry, y'all, technical difficulties, but it's okay. You can kind of see like what the screen reader is picking up here. And as I interact with it, it does change the state of what it's reading. So right now it's saying item 2 expanded, item 2 collapsed, item 2 expanded. So as I toggle it, it does announce it to the user what's happening on the screen. And that's exactly what we want to see. And that's why we're kind of creating this relationship between the elements. All right, so let's go back to our slides. So let's get into tabs interface. Let's go to the documentation for this. So again, follows the same pattern. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but you can see that it talks about the patterns, what are the pieces of that component, some examples, the expectations for the keyboard, and this one's pretty long. And then it talks about the role states and properties. So let's go back to the slides before we get to our example. So the design considerations here is that you should really have a couple of pieces. One is a tab list that contains the tabs elements, right? Then the tab is the specific tab that you kind of go through to display a specific content. And that piece that holds the content is the tab panel. So a tab list holds the tabs, and then the tabs will control the tab panel. And then here are the keyboard expectations for this type of component. So notice that for this one, it's a little bit different. That the tab, as you use your tab key, you shouldn't move from tab to tab. That should actually happen with your arrow keys. And the tab will actually take you out of that component or into the tab panel, right? Depending on how you set it up. And I'll show you an example soon. But that's something to keep in mind, that you're reading the specs to understand the keyboard interactions, because I often see a lot of tabs that are implemented in a way that as you tab, it moves you from tab to tab instead of using your arrow keys. And then they also list out some optional keyboard interactions that you might want to see. But for the tab list, so the thing that holds all of the tabs, you're going to want to have an Aria labeled by or an Aria label. For the role of tab, you're going to want to have Aria has control so that we understand what the relationship is between the content. And then Aria selected is set to true so that assistive technology knows that that specific tab has been selected. And then if you have a pop-up menu, then Aria pop-up has pop-up. And then the tab panel, which contains the content, has an Aria labeled by that's associated with that tab. And Aria orientation. If you don't set Aria orientation, the default is to be horizontal. All right, so here's kind of what we're seeing. So on the left-hand side, you're seeing that tab list with all of the tabs. And on the right-hand side, you're seeing the tab panels, so all of the content. And you can see that we have the roles, the Aria selected, Aria controls, and then Aria labeled by. And I'll go over this very briefly, this presentation, but we won't have time today. But there's something also called tab index that we'll be using for this component to help things kind of move in and out of the focus order. So let me quickly jump to an example. So let me first show you the keyboard interaction for this one. So I'm on a tab. So you can see that as I tap through, I'm not able to kind of move to the next tab. I can do that with my arrow keys. So I'm hitting left, 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 and you could see that it kind of follows that pattern, and that's what loads the next content. I'm going to go ahead and inspect this. And I'll do it like this. But you can see that as I inspect this, we see what we're expected to see, right? So we have, if we go to the tab list, this is a tab list with an Aria label of tab list, but you can have an Aria label of like menu items. Let's say that you have a website with a restaurant and each of these tabs is like a different menu, right? So you have breakfast, lunch, dinner, and all of these have an Aria label of menus. And then each tab, which is a button, will have a row of tab with Aria selected true. So as I move out of that tab, you can see that the Aria selected moves to false. So again, that's something that you'll have to toggle. And then the controls stay the same, which corresponds to the piece of content that it's dealing with, right? That it's interacting with, which should have a row of tab panel and should have an Aria label by kind of mapping back to that tab. So let me quickly jump back and talk to you all about the tab indexing. So you see that as I kind of move through these, the tab index is changing from tab index of 0 to tab index of -1. And the reason why that's happening is because these are buttons, and I talked about like semantic HTML bringing like accessibility features along with them. One of the semantic things that is built into a button is that you can tab to it, right? It's a tabbable element that goes in the same order in which it appears in the DOM. So if you want to take something out of that order so it's not tabbable, you would add tab index of -1 so that it can no longer be tabbed to. So that's kind of what we're seeing here. This implementation is if it's Aria selected false, then we're setting that tab index to -1 so it comes out of that rotation. And that's exactly what we want to see, and that's exactly what keyboard users are expecting from this component. Cool. So with that, I also I provided some resources for all of you. So the why Aria documentations that I've been talking through. I also want to quickly touch on web content accessibility guidelines, which are this set of documentations here. I'll kind of walk you through it very briefly, but they kind of talk about all of the things that you should be thinking about for accessibility, you know, and there's like 4 really main sections. One is to kind of make your content perceivable, so visible for all your users, operable, meaning that you're not like requiring an action that somebody simply cannot perform, whether that's through keyboard or other like input interfaces. Making sure that your content is understandable and robust so that it remains accessible as technologies advance. And they kind of talk through like different rules and guidelines that you can follow to make that happen. But with that, hope you enjoyed the presentation. And if you have any questions, just let me know, reach out to me or come talk to me after the talk. Thank you all so much.